You are watching Cycles of Power, and what we are about to show you is one of the most controversial and least examined financial stories behind the making of the modern world. Stay with us to the end, because the final revelation changes everything you thought you knew about how the 20th century was built. In 1917, the most powerful economy on Earth went to war, not because it was invaded, not because its cities were bombed, not because its people demanded it, but because a small group of men in suits, sitting in mahogany offices on Wall Street, were facing the potential loss of everything they had lent. And the way the situation resolved itself is one of the most consequential and least discussed dynamics in modern history. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a matter of congressional record, subpoenaed documents, and verified financial data that was investigated by the United States Senate itself. The investigation was closed before it could reach its final conclusions. The files were archived, and the story faded from public conversation. This is the story of how the First World War was, in the most precise financial sense, a business transaction. And America's entry into it raises questions that historians are still debating today. But to understand how we got there, we need to go back to a man who was already the most powerful private citizen in the Western world before the first shot of the war was ever fired. J.P. Morgan Sr. died in March of 1913 in a hotel suite in Rome at the age of 75. By the time of his death, he had personally intervened to stop 2 American financial panics, restructured the railroads that connected an entire continent, and built a network so vast that a later congressional investigation found his institution held direct or significant influence over more than 2,000 banks across the United States and Europe. He was not a banker in any sense we would recognize today. He was the de facto central bank of the Atlantic world. When he died, a senator stood up in Congress and said that a great power had passed from the earth. What the senator did not say, because perhaps he did not yet know, was that Morgan's son was about to prove himself more consequential than his father ever was. Because Jack Morgan, quieter and more methodical than the old man, was about to inherit the world at exactly the right moment. 14 months after the elder Morgan's death, Europe went to war. The official American position was neutrality. Woodrow Wilson, the former Princeton professor who had surprised the political establishment by winning the presidency in 1912, meant it sincerely. He was an idealist by temperament, a man who genuinely believed in the possibility of civilized international relations, and he read the mood of his country accurately. The American public looked at the slaughter in the fields of Belgium and France with horror and with distance. These were European problems, born of European monarchies and European rivalries that had nothing to do with a farmer in Iowa or a steelworker in Pittsburgh. But something was already happening beneath the surface that Wilson either could not see or chose not to examine too closely. While America's soldiers stayed home, America's money crossed the Atlantic almost immediately. Britain and France were consuming resources at a rate that no treasury in history had been built to sustain. Modern industrial war is, at its mechanical core, the organized destruction of material. Shells are fired and gone. Men are killed and must be replaced. Armies of millions must be fed every single day. The Allied powers needed American steel, American wheat, American chemicals, and American ammunition. And they did not have American dollars to pay for them. So they went to the one man in New York who could solve that problem. Jack Morgan signed the contract with the British government in the winter of 1914. The House of Morgan became the sole purchasing agent for the Allied powers in the United States. Every bullet, every uniform, every ton of grain, every chemical compound moving from American factories to Allied armies moved through Morgan's hands. And on every transaction, Morgan collected his commission. But here is what the history books almost never explain. The money never actually left America. Morgan organized syndicates of American banks to lend funds to the British and French governments. Those funds were deposited into Allied accounts at Morgan-affiliated banks in New York. Allied purchasing agents then drew from those accounts to pay American manufacturers. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, munitions plants in Connecticut, textile factories across the South. Many of these manufacturers were themselves clients or partial holdings within the Morgan network. The goods crossed the Atlantic and were consumed in the war. The money stayed in America, cycling through the industrial economy, generating returns at every stage. The debt accumulated on the balance sheets of the British and French governments owed entirely to American banks. It was a closed loop. Europe was bleeding, America was booming, and the architect of that loop was accumulating influence by the week. But then something strange happened. The war refused to end the way the financiers had expected. By late 1916, 2 years into what everyone had assumed would be a short conflict, the battlefield had turned into something no one had fully planned for. The German military had not collapsed. At Verdun, nearly 1 million men became casualties on both sides in a single battle that changed nothing on the map. At the Somme, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. 60,000 men in a single morning, and the front lines barely moved. The war was not concluding, it was consuming. Inside the private offices of J.P. Morgan and Company, The mood had shifted from confidence to something closer to controlled concern. Jack Morgan was a man who rarely showed emotion in professional settings. People who worked closely with him described a figure of almost mechanical composure, precise in his language, measured in his calculations, uncomfortable with sentiment of any kind. But in the private correspondence that would later surface in congressional investigations, a different picture emerges. A man watching a structure he had built with extraordinary care come under a pressure he had not fully anticipated. By late 1916, he understood the Allied balance sheets better than most Allied finance ministers did, and what he was seeing gave him serious cause for alarm. Britain had shipped the vast majority of its pre-war gold reserves to New York. France had liquidated its American investments. The Allied governments were approaching the hard limit of their collateral, the point beyond which no creditor, not even Morgan, could responsibly extend further credit. The numbers had stopped adding up. Morgan and his senior advisors ran the projections. The conclusion was mathematical. If the Allies could no longer borrow, they could no longer buy. If they could no longer buy, the American industrial expansion that had transformed the economy would stall. And if the Allies then lost the war, every dollar lent to them, $1.5 billion, would be at serious risk of default. The entire financial system, heavily leveraged on an Allied recovery, would face severe stress. There was one institution with deep enough resources to replace the thinning private credit lines, the United States Treasury. But the Treasury could only extend support to the Allies if the United States was no longer neutral. A country at war could fund its allies. A country at peace could not. The financial logic pointed in one direction, and the people who understood that logic had access to the people who made policy. Now here is where the story gets personal, because the figure at the center of all of this was Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was not a simple target. Wilson was an idealist, yes, but he was also a politician who understood power and who was structurally embedded in the financial networks of the Democratic Party establishment. The people who funded Democratic politics, who staffed his Treasury Department, who populated the social world of influence in Washington, moved within the same broader financial universe that Morgan inhabited. His closest advisor, a man named Edward Mandell House, moved between the White House and Wall Street with a fluency that suggested he considered both addresses equally familiar. House held no elected office and no official cabinet position. But insiders described him as the most influential unelected figure in the administration, the quiet channel through which the concerns of the financial world reached the executive office without requiring a formal meeting or a public record. When the credit situation of late 1916 required attention at the highest level, the message did not need to be delivered as a demand. It arrived as a quiet, accumulated understanding that neutrality was becoming financially unsustainable. The pressure was structural, and it was difficult to argue with, but Wilson still faced a problem that no private understanding could solve. The American people did not want war. He had won re-election in November of 1916 by the narrowest of margins, and the votes that secured his victory came from citizens who believed the position he had campaigned on. He kept us out of war. Changing that position without a compelling public justification would be politically impossible. He needed a story, and the story needed to be constructed before the decision was announced. What happened next had been in development for 2 years, and most Americans never knew it existed. In 1914, the British government established a covert communications operation housed in Wellington House in London. It was staffed not by soldiers, but by writers, academics, and former journalists who understood how public opinion is shaped and how it can be redirected without the target population being fully aware of the process. Their primary strategic objective was to shift American public sentiment toward the Allied cause. They worked through American journalists and publications that appeared independent. They placed stories. They arranged visits for influential Americans to the front lines, carefully managed visits designed to produce sympathetic coverage, and they amplified certain narratives about German conduct in Belgium that were, to put it carefully, not always verifiable. One report in particular circulated widely across the American press and generated significant public reaction. It described systematic German violence against Belgian civilians, assembled under the credible name of Lord Bryce, a former British ambassador to the United States whose reputation gave the document authority with American readers. The report was distributed to newspapers across the country and produced exactly the shift in sentiment it was designed to produce. Later, historical examination of the underlying evidence raised serious questions about the verifiability of many of the testimonies included. What is documented is that the report functioned effectively as a tool for shaping public perception, regardless of the questions raised about its sourcing. The American government, when it committed to intervention, constructed its own domestic communications infrastructure. George Creel, a journalist, was handed control of the Committee on Public Information. Creel understood something fundamental about democratic societies. You cannot instruct a free population what to think. You have to build the conditions under which they arrive at a conclusion themselves and experience it as their own. The committee produced millions of posters, pamphlets, and films. It trained 75,000 volunteers to appear in movie theaters between film reels and deliver 4-minute speeches, scripted by professional writers, designed to produce a specific emotional sequence: fear, duty, urgency. The speeches were written in Washington and delivered by men who appeared to be ordinary citizens speaking from personal conviction. Across thousands of venues, simultaneously, the message was consistent. The threat was real. Neutrality was a risk. And buying war bonds was the practical expression of patriotism. The Sedition Act provided the boundaries of permissible speech. Eugene Debs, a former presidential candidate with nearly 1 million votes to his name, was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for delivering an anti-war speech in Ohio. The range of acceptable public opinion narrowed considerably within a short period. The propagandists still needed a concrete and verifiable public event to serve as the visible justification for what the financial and political logic had already made likely. It arrived in February of 1917, and what happened next genuinely surprised Washington. The Zimmermann telegram was a real document. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had sent a coded message to the Mexican government proposing a potential military arrangement. Germany would support Mexico in pursuing territorial claims in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in exchange for Mexican engagement against the United States. British intelligence, the codebreakers working in the section known as Room 40, had intercepted and deciphered the message weeks earlier. They then held it, calculating when its release would produce the most significant effect on American opinion, before handing it to American officials in late February. The proposal was genuine, and when it became public, the argument for continued neutrality became very difficult to sustain. Here was documentary evidence of a foreign power actively seeking to direct military action against American territory. Wilson had his public justification, and crucially, it was real, which meant it could not be dismissed. Wilson went to Congress in April. He received his declaration of war, and within days, the financial mechanism that the political situation had been building toward moved into action. Congress passed the Liberty Loan Acts, authorizing the federal government to raise significant funds from the American public through war bonds. The public argument was straightforward. Lend your savings to your government, earn your interest, support the war effort. The bonds sold in large quantities because the months of public messaging had prepared the audience. What was less prominent in the public conversation was the destination of a significant portion of those funds. Much of the money raised was extended to Britain and France as intergovernmental loans. Britain and France then used this fresh American government credit to address their outstanding obligations to the private banking syndicate. The exposure that had been held on private bank balance sheets was absorbed into the public account of the United States government. The soldiers crossed the Atlantic, and the financial risk that had accumulated over 3 years was now distributed across the American tax-paying public, who had been brought to support this outcome through months of carefully managed public communication. In France, observing all of this from inside the military structure, was a Marine officer named Smedley Butler. Butler was not a theorist. He was a combat soldier, decorated twice with the Medal of Honor, one of the most recognized military figures in American history. He had served the institutional interests of American foreign policy faithfully for decades, and when he retired, he wrote a short book called War is a Racket. In it, he documented that during the First World War, American industry produced 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires. He described his own career in terms that surprised many readers, as a person deployed in service of commercial and financial interests, rather than purely national ones. His account carried weight precisely because of who he was. A decorated veteran with no political agenda was describing a pattern he had observed from the inside. That description made people uncomfortable in ways that an academic argument could not. Have you ever wondered what really drives a country into war? It's often more complicated than the history books tell us. Let's talk about a book that stirred up so much controversy. It led to an official investigation by the U.S. Congress. Back in 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota started looking into why America really joined World War I. For 2 years, his committee dug through financial records and questioned witnesses under oath. What they found was explosive. They discovered arms manufacturers who lobbied against peace because neutrality was bad for business. They found clear links between the financial pressures of 1916 and the political decisions that followed. The evidence they gathered pointed to a story far different from the official narrative of fighting for democracy. It suggested that powerful financial interests had a major hand in pushing the country toward war. But just as the committee was getting close to some very uncomfortable conclusions, its funding was cut. The political climate had changed. With another war brewing in Europe, a story about financial interests driving military intervention became inconvenient. The investigation was shut down, the final report was never written, and the full picture was left incomplete. But one thing couldn't be buried: the data. The numbers tell a story all their own. Before the war, the United States had about 375 tons of gold. Britain had 550 tons and France had over 1,000. Under the gold standard, the country with the most gold held the most power in the global financial system. By 1919, just a few years later, the United States held over 4,000 tons of gold. The European powers were broke. Their gold had flowed across the Atlantic to pay for the weapons and supplies that fueled the war. This was the single largest transfer of monetary reserves in recorded history, and it happened in just 4 years. The financial center of the world didn't just drift from London to New York over decades. It moved decisively through the mechanics of wartime trade and debt while the fighting was still going on. And it didn't stop there. The peace treaty that ended the war was designed to make sure this new economic order stuck. The reparations forced on Germany at the Treaty of Versailles were incredibly controversial. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who was there at the negotiations, argued that the numbers weren't based on what Germany could actually pay. Instead, he claimed they were calculated to be just enough to cover the massive war debts the Allies owed to American banks. Whether intentional or not, the result was a disaster. Germany's economy, already shattered by the war, collapsed. Hyperinflation in 1923 wiped out the savings of the German middle class, creating widespread resentment and social chaos. This economic despair paved the way for a certain kind of political leader to rise to power a decade later, with devastating consequences. The Peace Treaty of 1919 didn't create a stable world. It laid the financial groundwork for a second, even bigger conflict. The greed embedded in that treaty created a path the world would tragically walk down for the next 20 years. So now we get to the heart of it. The observation that explains not just what happened then, but how power really shifts in the world. By 1919, the war was over. The soldiers had paraded home, the speeches were made, but something fundamental had changed. The center of the world had moved, and it didn't move through conquest or invasion, the way we usually think about empires rising and falling. The center of the world moved because one nation had financed the destruction of all the others and was left holding the receipts when the smoke cleared. London went into the war as the undisputed financial capital of the planet. It came out a debtor. New York went in as a second-tier player. It came out holding a third of the world's monetary gold, and the power to set the rules for the global economy for the next 100 years. This didn't happen because America had a stronger military at the start, or because its cause was more righteous. It happened because the people who controlled its financial institutions understood a crucial principle before the first shot was even fired. The nation that lends the money for a war gets to define the world that comes after it. That understanding didn't just disappear after World War I. It became a core part of American foreign policy for every decade that followed. The details changed, the locations changed, the conflicts changed, but the underlying pattern remained. And tracing that pattern is what this channel, Cycles of Power, is all about. So the next time the drums of war begin to beat, and history tells us they always do, the next time you hear soaring language about moral necessity in speeches and news articles, the next time a conflict in some faraway place is suddenly presented as an urgent civilizational crisis that demands sacrifice from ordinary people, ask the question that Senator Nye's committee was shut down for asking. Don't just ask who the enemy is. Ask where the money is. Who has the financial exposure? Who needs that exposure protected? And have the people being asked to pay the price, with their lives and their futures, been told the whole story? The war ended in 1918. The cycle did not. This is Cycles of Power. If this episode gave you a new lens to view the history you thought you knew, the best thing you can do is share it with one person who might find it useful. That single share helps this analysis reach the people who need to hear it. Hit the like button to help the algorithm spread it even further. Subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll examine the Dawes and Young plans and the deliberate financial architecture of the 1920s that turned the end of one war into the foundation for the next. And make sure you turn on notifications, because the next part of this cycle is already in motion. This is Cycles of Power. We'll see you in the next episode.